The glass hit me before I even realized what was happening. Cold red wine running down my face while she stood there glaring at me across the table. Her voice sharp as a knife, as she shouted that all I ever did was eat and drink and sit around as if I owned the place. And in that moment, with everyone staring and my son frozen in silence, I felt a kind of humiliation I had never known before. But I also knew deep inside me that this night was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. Thank you so much for watching and giving me your time. It means more than you know, and I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because every story like mine connects us in ways we cannot imagine. And as I sit here sharing this painful memory, I want you to feel the weight of what happened. Not just the wine on my face, but the silence in the room. The silence that told me I was unwanted in a place I had poured my heart and strength into. I stayed still with that sting burning my skin and my pride. And in that stillness I realized how quickly kindness can be forgotten when people choose to see you as a burden instead of a blessing. And that night my quiet became my shield, because sometimes words are wasted on ears that do not wish to hear. I suppose I should tell you a little about myself, so you understand how deep that night cut into me. I am a woman who worked her whole life with tired hands and a determined heart. I raised my son on my own after his father passed far too young. I carried the weight of bills, school fees, and long nights with no one to lean on. I made sure he had shoes on his feet and books in his bag, even when it meant I wore the same coat for years. I built a small savings by skipping meals and working double shifts, and every penny I put aside was for him and for the life I prayed he would one day have, when he grew older and found a woman he wanted to marry. I welcomed her with open arms. I told myself she was the daughter I never had. I helped with their wedding. I gave from what I had saved. I cooked for gatherings and smiled even when my back ached from standing too long. I thought I was building a bond of trust and love, but sometimes kindness is mistaken for weakness. Sometimes silence is mistaken for having nothing to give. The truth is, I had given more than anyone ever knew. Because when they bought the house, it was my money that covered the down payment. When their car arrived, it was my signature that secured it. When they hired a nanny so she could rest, it was my account that sent the funds each month. I never boasted. I never asked for credit. I only wanted them to feel safe and cared for. But slowly I began to see the coldness in her eyes, the way she would dismiss me when I spoke, the way she would roll her eyes when I set the table or tried to help. And though I told myself to endure for the sake of peace, the wound of being treated as unnecessary kept growing inside me. Still I stayed quiet. Still I smiled. Because I thought in time she would see my heart. I thought love would eventually be enough. But that night when she threw the wine, I understood that her heart was closed, long before I ever stepped into that house. It was supposed to be such a simple family dinner. One of those evenings where everyone sits together, where laughter fills the air, where the smell of food warms the heart before it even touches the tongue. I had baked all morning, rolling dough with careful hands, adding just the right spices to make the house smell like love. I even carried my pies with both hands pressed against my chest so they would not shift on the way. And when I stepped into their kitchen, I moved quietly, placing my dishes on the counter, arranging the gifts I had bought for her parents on the side table, little things wrapped in paper that took me all week to prepare. I tied each bow slowly, thinking of how they might smile when they opened them. I thought maybe she would see how much I cared, how much I wanted to belong. But I should have known that no matter what I brought to that table, it would never be enough for her. The dining room looked so bright that night, the table set with polished glasses, the candles flickering against the window. And as we all sat down, I watched my son smile nervously, as if trying to keep the air light. I watched her take her seat at the end of the table, her chin tilted upward like she owned every corner of the room. I told myself not to mind, that maybe the wine would soften her, that maybe a warm dinner would remind her that family is not a contest but a bond. And at first it almost felt possible. The conversation began with harmless words about the weather and the meal, her parents nodding politely, and I passed dishes around with my old hands, careful not to spill a thing. Yet even then I caught her eyes on me, sharp and unkind, as though each bite I took was too much for her to bear. I tried to swallow that feeling down with each spoonful, smiling when I wanted to sigh, keeping my shoulders straight even though the weight of her disapproval pressed against me like a stone. But as the wine flowed, her tongue loosened, her laughter grew louder, the small jabs sharper, little comments about how I sat, how I spoke, how I ate, and each one landed like a thorn, my heart beating faster with every passing minute. I glanced at my son, but his eyes darted away, his silence louder than any insult. And in that silence, I realized that the love I thought would protect me had no shield. I was sitting in a room full of people, yet I had never felt so alone. And when she finally stood, glass raised and eyes burning, I knew before she opened her mouth that the storm I had been bracing for all these months was about to break. And still I sat frozen, gripping the edge of my chair, praying I was wrong, praying she would sit back down, but the words came out with such venom that my chest tightened and my breath caught. Words that turned a warm dinner into a battlefield. Words that made me a stranger in a home I had built with my sacrifice. The words left her lips like fire, scorching the air around us. She pointed at me as if I were some uninvited guest at their table, her voice rising over the clatter of forks and the hush of breath. She said I sat around like a queen doing nothing, eating and drinking as if I had earned none of it. And then, with a laugh that cut through me, she lifted her glass high and flung the red wine across the table. It struck me so suddenly, warm liquid splashing across my face, dripping into my clothes, staining the blouse I had ironed so carefully that afternoon. I remember the sound of the glass hitting the table, the gasp that rose from her mother, the silence that followed. It was as if time itself stopped in that room. My hands trembled, but I did not raise them. I kept still, because I knew if I moved, it would only give her more reason to sneer. I turned to my son for a sign, for a single word of defense, but he sat frozen, lips pressed together, his eyes refusing to meet mine. And that silence, that cold refusal to stand beside me, that silence hurt far more than the wine dripping down my face. I felt smaller than I ever had, as though every year of sacrifice, every dollar saved, every meal cooked, every night spent worrying about his future meant nothing in that moment. I thought of the times I carried him when he was weak, of the nights I skipped meals so he could eat, of the times I stood in the rain waiting for him after school, when I could barely keep my legs from shaking. And now here I was, treated like a burden, thrown aside in front of strangers. My heart broke, but I swallowed the pain. I refused to let her see me cry. I refused to give her that victory. She leaned back in her chair, smirking as though she had proven some point. Her parents sat in uneasy silence, and I felt the heat of shame spread across my chest. Yet I forced my back to remain straight, because even in that moment, I knew that dignity was the only shield I had left. And though I felt betrayed by my own blood, I whispered inside myself that the story was not over, that one day she would know exactly who I was and what I had done for that house, and that thought alone kept me from breaking down in front of them all. She did not stop at the wine, no, she wanted to finish what she started. She pushed back her chair with such force the legs scraped against the floor, and before I could even wipe my face clean, she was already tugging at my arm, her words spitting out like venom that I had overstayed my welcome, that I was nothing more than a weight dragging their lives down. She stormed past me into the hallway, and I heard the sharp snap of a suitcase pulled from the closet. I sat frozen for a moment, my chest tight, my son still silent, his head bowed as if shame had glued him to his chair. And then I watched as she came back, dragging my suitcase behind her, each thud of the wheels across the floor sounding like a hammer against my heart. She tossed it near the door, my coat following with a careless fling, and with a voice as cold as the snow waiting outside, she told me to get out of her house. I remember standing there, my feet heavy as stone, the laughter from earlier gone, replaced by the sound of my breath trembling in my throat. I looked at the table still filled with the food I had helped prepare, the candles flickering, the gifts untouched. And I thought to myself how strange it was that a home I had poured so much into could turn on me so quickly. I bent down slowly, my fingers brushing the handle of my suitcase, and I felt the sting of humiliation settle deep inside me. The air outside was bitter and sharp as she swung the door wide, snowflakes rushing in, clinging to my wet clothes, my shoes sinking into the icy ground as I stepped out with nothing but that suitcase. I glanced back one last time, hoping, just hoping, that my son would rise, that he would stop her, that he would take my arm and say this was wrong. But he did not move, his silence louder than her shouting. And so I pulled my coat around my shoulders and stood in the snow, the cold burning against my skin, the weight of betrayal heavier than the suitcase I dragged behind me. And in that moment, I promised myself that if they thought I was nothing, I would show them how quickly nothing could become everything they depended on. The night swallowed me whole as I walked away from that house, the snow crunching beneath my feet with every slow step, the suitcase dragging behind me, leaving a crooked trail across the white ground. The cold air stung my cheeks, but it was nothing compared to the burning inside my chest. I kept my head low, not because of the wind, but because I could not bear the thought of anyone seeing me like that, covered in wine, shivering, carrying the weight of a life I had built for others only to be cast aside like an unwanted guest. The houses I passed seemed to glow with warmth, curtains drawn, families laughing inside. And for a moment, I wondered how many women had walked in silence like I was walking now, carrying stories they never told, hiding bruises that were not on the skin but on the soul. I thought of my husband long gone, of how he once promised me I would never be alone. And I whispered into the night that I wished he could have been there, because perhaps then no one would have dared to treat me as they did. Yet even in that ache, I straightened my shoulders and kept moving. I thought of all the nights I stayed awake to pay their bills, all the days I signed checks they never saw, all the times I gave them comfort when they did not even thank me. And as the snow fell heavier, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because I realized that they believed I was powerless. They believed throwing me into the cold meant victory. But the truth, the quiet truth, was that I held the strings that tied their life together. Every smile under their roof, every meal on their table, every comfort they flaunted came from the very woman they had just thrown into the dark. I whispered to myself that they had made the gravest mistake. Because silence does not mean weakness, and leaving does not mean defeat. Sometimes leaving is the beginning of a reckoning. And with each step further from that house, I felt my dignity grow stronger. I no longer trembled from humiliation. I carried myself through the snow with the quiet fire of a woman who knew that she was about to change everything. When I finally reached my small room that night, I sat on the edge of my bed still in my wet clothes, the suitcase by my feet unopened, the sting of wine on my skin mixing with the sting of betrayal in my chest. I stared at the wall for what felt like hours, not crying, not speaking, just letting the silence of the room wrap around me. And slowly my mind began to move back over the years, to every sacrifice I had made, to every choice I had carried alone. I remembered the nights I stayed late at work, even when my legs ached so badly I thought they would give out. I remembered folding every dollar into envelopes, tucking them away for my son's future. I remembered the day they bought that house, and how my hand shook when I signed the papers, not from fear but from pride, because I wanted him to feel secure. I remembered the new car parked in their driveway, how shiny it was, how proud they looked. And I remembered the papers I had signed, the quiet payment I made each month to keep it in their hands. I remembered the nanny's smiling face, the one they thought they afforded on their own, never knowing it was my account that sent her money. All of it done in silence, all of it done with love. And as I sat there with the snow still clinging to my coat, I realized the power I held had never been in their hands, it had always been in mine. They believed they were casting me out like useless baggage, but the truth was, they were standing on a floor I built, under a roof I paid for, living in comfort wrapped in the fabric of my sacrifices. And as that truth burned in me, I felt something change. The shame that had wrapped itself around my shoulders like chains began to loosen. The silence in that house, the humiliation at that table, it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the first crack in the mask they had worn. because now I knew that with one decision I could unravel everything they took for granted. I whispered into the night that they would learn, not through screaming, not through fighting, but through the simple removal of my quiet support. And that thought gave me strength. Strength I had forgotten I even carried. And I knew when the sun rose I would no longer be the woman they thought they could throw into the snow. I would be the woman who showed them how fragile their comfort truly was. The next morning I rose with the weight of decision pressing against me. I brewed a cup of tea, but it sat untouched on the table as I gathered the papers I had hidden away for years, every deed, every account statement, every proof of what I had given. And as my hands spread them across the bed, the truth looked back at me in black and white. The mortgage contract bearing my name as guarantor, the loan papers with my signature scrawled in careful strokes, the bank transfers that carried thousands from my savings into their accounts month after month. All of it staring at me as evidence of a life they lived on the strength of a woman they had thrown out into the cold. I folded each paper neatly, slid them into a leather folder that had belonged to my husband, and with a steady heart I put on my coat. I walked down the icy street to the office of my lawyer, a man who had guided me quietly for years. He looked up from his desk as I entered, his brow furrowed when he saw the determination on my face. I laid the folder before him and said with a voice that did not tremble that it was time. He opened the documents one by one, nodding slowly, and when he finally raised his eyes to mine, he asked if I truly wished to end every support. I answered him without hesitation that I wanted them to stand on their own if they believed I was nothing. I wanted them to know what life felt like without the foundation I had built under their feet. He leaned back, clasped his hands, and told me it would be done. Accounts closed, transfers stopped, ownership quietly secured in my name alone. And as he spoke, I felt a calm strength flow into me. Not the fiery kind that shouts, but the quiet kind that holds steady. When I left his office, the snow had begun to melt, little streams running down the street, and I thought to myself how fitting it was. The ice breaking, the cold softening, just as my resolve had solidified. I no longer carried humiliation. I carried purpose, and I knew that every bill they opened, every call they received, every letter that arrived in the coming days would carry my silence as an answer. And that silence would speak louder than any wine thrown in anger. It did not take long before the storm I had quietly set in motion began to reach their doorstep. Only 3 days had passed when the first cracks appeared. The nanny did not arrive that morning, and when she was called, she simply explained that her payment had not been made. The car that had always gleamed in the driveway now had a letter tucked under the windshield wiper. A warning that the loan was past due. And inside the house the mail piled high with envelopes stamped in red demanding attention. I could almost picture the look on her face when she tore them open one by one, her voice rising in anger as she asked my son what he had done. I imagined him stammering, confused, because he never handled the money. He never asked where it came from. He simply lived as though comfort was his right. And now that comfort was slipping through his fingers. I heard later from a neighbor that the arguments could be heard through the walls, her shouting, his pleading. The two of them circling each other in panic, the groceries lighter, the lights flickering when the bill went unpaid, all of it unraveling faster than they could contain. And through it all, I remained silent. I did not answer the calls that came to my phone. I did not reply to the messages that tried to soften their tone. I sat by my window with my tea warm in my hands, the same window where I had once watched the world with worry. And this time I watched with calm, because I knew every moment of their collapse was not born of my cruelty but of their ingratitude. They believed I was a burden, but the truth was that I had carried them. And now, without my hand holding theirs, they stumbled, they fell, and they learned. And as each day passed, my heart grew stronger, because revenge had not been delivered in shouts or scenes, but in the quiet unveiling of truth. And truth is always heavier than lies. Truth settles deep and cannot be shaken away. And I knew they were only just beginning to understand who it was that had truly kept their family together. It was on the third evening, as the sky turned dark and the snow began to fall heavy again, that I heard the knock at my door. Slow at first, then hurried. And when I opened it, there she was. The same woman who had thrown wine into my face, standing in the very snow she had once cast me into. Her hands bare and trembling, her hair damp from the cold, her eyes wide with panic, and behind her voice that once carried only scorn now carried desperation. She begged me to come back, her words stumbling over each other, saying that things had gone wrong, that bills were stacking up, that the comfort she had once taken for granted was slipping through her hands. She even reached out as though to touch my arm, but I stepped back, because the memory of her voice ordering me out of her house still burned fresh in my mind. I watched her lips quiver as she said she had been wrong, that she did not know, that she had never realized what I had done for them. And I stood there silent, listening to the same mouth that had once cursed me now pleading for my mercy. In that moment I felt no anger, only a heavy sadness, because she was not begging out of love, she was begging out of fear. Fear of losing the life I had built for her, fear of standing without the foundation I had quietly laid beneath her feet. I thought of my son inside that house, his head surely lowered, ashamed yet still silent. I thought of the neighbors who might be watching from their windows, just as they had watched me drag my suitcase through the snow. And I realized how quickly the tables had turned. The one who had humiliated me now humiliated herself before me. Her tears freezing on her cheeks, her voice cracking in the night. But I did not move, I did not speak. I let the silence stretch between us, because silence was all she had given me when I needed her to see my worth. And as she stood there shivering, I felt the power of dignity rise inside me, a power greater than revenge, because she was learning in that moment what I had always known, that cruelty has a price, that ungratefulness always returns to its source. I closed the door slowly, not in anger, not in triumph, but in peace. And as the latch clicked, I leaned against it and drew in a long breath. My heart steady, because for the first time in years, I felt the weight of their judgment lift from my shoulders. And all that remained was the quiet strength of knowing I had finally been seen. Not through their eyes, but through the truth they could no longer escape. That night, after I closed the door, I sat in the quiet of my little room. The snow still falling outside and the sound of her desperate knocking fading into the distance. I laid my hands in my lap and let the silence wash over me. And in that stillness, I thought of everything that had led me here. Every sacrifice I had made in the shadows. Every long hour spent saving for a future that was not my own. Every dollar that left my hand to bring comfort to theirs. And I realized that my life had been built on giving, while theirs had been built on taking. And when I was no longer there to hold them steady, the walls they thought were strong began to crumble. I imagined her face as she walked back through that snow. The same snow she had thrown me into. Only now it clung to her clothes as it had to mine. Except she did not wear it with pride. She wore it with shame. Shame that comes when the truth arrives uninvited. I thought of my son, his silence like a shadow behind her. And I asked myself if he understood now the cost of that silence, if he finally saw that standing by while someone else tears apart the very hands that raised you is a betrayal worse than words. I did not know if his heart could ever change, but I knew mine had. Because for the first time, I felt no need to explain, no need to defend myself, no need to beg for a place at a table I had paid for. I found peace in knowing that dignity had carried me further than their cruelty ever could. I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the steam rise in the glow of a single lamp, the room small but warm. And I thought about how strange it is that sometimes you must lose a home to find your own strength. Sometimes you must be thrown out to finally step in. I smiled softly because I understood that revenge had already happened without me lifting a finger. Their comfort had vanished the moment I stopped holding it together. And though they might rebuild someday, they would never forget the night they saw how quickly the world can change when gratitude is absent. I whispered a prayer for myself. Not for them. A prayer of thanks that I still had breath, that I still had strength, that I still had my pride. Because life had shown me that you do not always win by shouting the loudest. Sometimes you win by standing silent and letting truth do the talking. And in that moment I knew my story was not one of defeat, but of quiet victory. The kind of victory that lingers in the heart long after the snow has melted. As the days passed, I felt a lightness I had not known in years. I woke each morning, not with dread, but with calm, knowing that my life was finally my own. I no longer sat waiting for their words. I no longer measured my worth against their approval. Instead, I measured it against the truth of my sacrifices and the dignity that no one could take from me. I understood now that betrayal does not have to break you. It can carve out a space inside you where strength begins to grow. I realized too that love without respect is only a shadow, and that silence, when chosen with courage, can be louder than any argument. I sit here today, with a steady heart sharing this story because I know many have walked paths like mine, and if my voice reaches even one soul who feels discarded, I want them to know they are not alone. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of my story. Your time means more than you know, and if you felt something in your heart tonight, please subscribe and stay with me for the next truth I will share.